Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Corombos of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Very glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Jim Garrity is away, as you know, and we'll have a little bit more to say about his travels in the second martini today. In his place, once again, Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. We have good, we have bad, we have crazy martinis for you today. We'll be talking about all the back and forth on a number of issues in New York City politics, which is where Inez lives, over the congestion toll, which got a lot of attention yesterday. We'll also get her reaction to President Trump's tweet, or was it a truth, about Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday. And then we're going to start here with the designation of gangs and cartels as terrorist organizations when it comes to the border. And so, Inez, always great to have you with us. No shortage of serious stories once again today. It's like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah, and most of the time in the last month, I've been very pleased with the fire hose, but it does keep coming.
Let's jump right in. This is the NBC version of the story on the border. The U.S. State Department has designated Mexican drug cartels, as well as MS-13 and the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, as foreign terrorist organizations, according to a document set to be published Thursday in the Federal Register. Secretary of State Marco Rubio signed the designation, posted online for preview Wednesday, which will open the door for possible financial sanctions against Tren de Aragua, MS-13, as well as the following drug cartels: Cartel de Sinaloa, Cartel de Jalisco, Nueva Generación, Carteles Unidos, Cartel de Noreste, Cartel de Golfo, and La Nueva Familia Michoacana. And I'm sure my Spanish teachers are cringing right now, but Inez, basically, they blame the cartels for a campaign of violence and terror throughout the Western Hemisphere. Quote, that has not only destabilized countries with significant importance for our national interests, but also flooded the United States with deadly drugs, violent criminals, and vicious gangs. And so this obviously gives the government more tools to apply sanctions and other things by going with this designation. We'll talk about a tool being suggested by Senator Mike Lee in just a second. But first of all, how significant is this designation?
I think it's significant and both in the specifics and from the 10,000-foot perspective. The 10,000-foot perspective is, this is I admittedly stole this from the great New York Post headline writers, but I think they called it the Don Roe Doctrine. But it's clearly a focus on what's closer and what's in America's direct interests. And one of the most obvious things that's in our direct interest is to have a safe border with Mexico, a shut border to drugs, to crime, to floods of illegals, all of which the cartels have had a heavy hand in creating, right? Both the flow of drugs and of people has been their, one of their bread and butter sort of industries has been smuggling people into the United States and controlling the flow of people perhaps more carefully and to more their benefit than the United States is controlling the flow of people over the border. So this is something that I think is totally justifiable. I think it's one of those it should be really basic sort of foreign policy goals for the United States. If you were to look at a map and you were an alien, you would be surprised to find, U.S. interests described as far flung as, halfway around the world in Ukraine, which we'll get to in a minute, but not on our own border, right? There we're hands off. So I think this is very justifiable from that perspective. I do think it's complicated because Mexico is not a strong state. It is fair to describe it as a narco state, right? So these cartels actually form part of the basis of government in Mexico. If we actually look at it from a realist perspective, as opposed to, the way that, the PR office of the Mexican government would say it, it's pretty clear that the Mexican government doesn't control these cartels. They don't have the capability to control these cartels, and that also these cartels take up some of the official state functions of government, charity, local government services, right? So it is complicated, and there is the big question, especially, in a post-Iraq world, what happens after the cartels? If the United States smashes the cartels, what does the future look like? Even though these are very, very evil organizations, what does the future look like? Does it look like stability or chaos in Mexico?
So when the question arises, is it that the Mexican government can't or won't effectively deal with the cartel? It's a little bit of both? I
think it's a little bit of both, yeah. I think, many times in its history, Mexico has a weak central government. It's not entirely clear that the Mexican government has like the monopoly on state violence, right? The monopoly of violence that makes up the basic of a government. And that's not really true in Mexico on the ground. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a dangerous and volatile situation. I think we definitely have the right to take action against the cartels that are causing so much violence and, drug trafficking and violations of our own laws on our own side of the border. So it's not that I'm worried about. It's just, again, if we smash the cartels, what comes next in Mexico? I'm not sure that anybody really knows the answer to that question.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ideas being put out there. Would we use drone technology, drone strikes against cartels now that we've made this designation? Obviously, people would be concerned, but might be considering actual troops. Another tool that's being thrown out there by Utah Senator Mike Lee, and Donald Trump Jr. was just highlighting this on X the other day, is letters of marque and reprisal, which have not been used in a very long time, but could be used potentially, since they are still legal, to authorize private security firms or specially trained civilians to intercept cartel operations. So, Inez, you have a lot more legal training than I do. What do we need to know in terms of the Cliff's Notes on letters of marque and reprisal?
Yeah, I mean, you basically just described it, right? It's a state-sanctioned hit on an actor, right? And it's a very old tool, and it's in our Constitution. It would be just funny to see this kind of stuff come back. I don't know how practical it is in the case of cartels because they are so well armed. Like, I'm not sure that there are that many outfits that aren't official militaries in the world that have the kind of firepower that the cartels have. That being said, if some enterprising mercenaries want a shot, I'm not against the idea. It's definitely going to be cheaper for the United States in both blood and treasure if somebody else does it for us.
Well, I certainly would not be surprised if they face a lot more hostility once they're on our side of the border, which has been a very common occurrence, especially in recent years. So I don't know if their tactics are going to change in that respect because they know there is a lot different focus, a lot different intensity of border security now. But we'll see how they adjust. They always do, because there's a lot of money to be made there in terms of trafficking humans, trafficking weapons, trafficking drugs, and the like. So
yeah, and they're about to lose a quite serious piece of their income if it becomes much, much harder to traffic people into the United States, which it appears to be already, right? So, and certainly the Trump administration is going to continue to make the border a priority and law enforcement at the border a priority. That is going to be a major source of income that disappears for the cartels. And as you say, they adjust. This is why I have a problem with the libertarian argument. Well, let's just legalize fentanyl, right? Let's just legalize everything and then they won't make any money. No, they'll find other ways, other illicit ways to make money. They've shifted between different drugs. They've shifted now to human smuggling. Unless you want to literally legalize everything and open the border, there's no way that they're not going to find illicit streams of income. So they're very flexible in that way.
All right, Inez, on to our second martini now. And some days we record and big news breaks right after we record, and you're like, oh man, I wish we could have talked about that today. And other times you're like, oh, I'm kind of glad we have another day to chew on this and see exactly what we think about it and have time to think about it. And that's what happened yesterday. It was on Tuesday that President Trump drew some raised eyebrows in his characterization of Europe and Ukraine as the talks in Riyadh began involving our Secretary of State, National Security Advisor. And then yesterday, Trump with I think this is a truth post, got a lot of people talking. Here's what it says. Think of it, a modestly successful comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky, talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won, that never had to start, but a war that he, without the U.S. and Trump, will never be able to settle. The United States has spent $200 billion more than Europe, and Europe's money is guaranteed, while the United States will get nothing back. Why didn't sleepy Joe Biden demand equalization in that this war is far more important to Europe than it is to us? We have a big, beautiful ocean as separation. On top of this, Zelensky admits that half of the money we sent to him is missing. He refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. A dictator without elections, Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something I'll admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. Biden never tried. Europe has failed to bring peace, and Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going. I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered and millions have unnecessarily died. And so it continues. And as when you look at this, there are certainly things you would counter in terms of the facts, including that very first line where he says Volodymyr Zelensky talked the United States into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be one that never had to start. It seems he's implying that Zelensky could have stopped this war from starting. I don't know if that's what he intended there, but that's certainly not the case. Obviously, Russia was the invader here. Obviously, a lot of people reacting. Some people are saying this is just Trump's way of trying to goad Zelensky to get into the peace talks. Others are saying this is, coddling Putin, who the president won't call a dictator, but he will call Zelensky a dictator. You've got a unique perspective on this because you've got family ties that know what the bad side of Russia and the Soviet Union are like. So how do you view this?
Yeah, like you said, there's a lot of threads to disentangle here. I didn't really read it the way that you just implied about that he was blaming Ukraine for the start of the war. I think he's more alluding to the claims that he's made that sound outlandish, but I think actually is hard to deny that there's at least the possibility that they're true, that this war never would have started if he had been president, that it would have been deterred. And there's certainly some evidence of that, right? Putin started amassing troops on the Ukrainian border. I think it was like 10 days or 12 days after the disastrous pullout from Afghanistan, and the way that the U.S. military was unable to execute that, regardless of whether you think we should have gone or stayed. Like, it was just a big paper tiger moment, flashing, sort of invitation to America's enemies that we were in disarray. And Putin started moving on this action to invade Ukraine. Literally, like, not even 2 weeks after that. And so I think that there is a case to be made for what initially sounds like one of those over-the-top Trumpisms, right? Like, oh, well, if I were president, the war never would have started. I actually think he's got a pretty good case to make on that front. So I think that's how I read that allusion, by the way, was that this war never should have started because I should have been president. In any case, so about the specifics about Zelensky, look, America is a unique place. We held elections even during the Civil War on both sides, right? Both for Abraham Lincoln and in the Confederacy. And when they were losing, on their heels, about to collapse, they still held elections. And the United States has not accepted the excuse of wartime to postpone elections. So I think that is something that's unique about the United States. I don't think it's particularly unusual for countries to forego elections in the middle of this kind of level of wartime at all. And I don't think that means that Zelensky's a dictator. So some of the specifics, like you said, I don't agree with. Fundamentally, this goes back to the first segment we talked about. This was the Don Roe doctrine, right? Donald Trump clearly sees the U.S. interests in Ukraine as much, much more attenuated than the previous administration, and than most of his party does. And increasingly, American polls agree with that position. As for his right to negotiate, the U.S. is propping up the Ukrainian war effort. And if we decide to pull that support, of course, Ukraine has no chance. Now, the part of it that I think is a little unfair here is, I don't think this war was lost from the beginning. In fact, Ukrainians have fought, harder and more valiantly and more effectively than Vladimir Putin expected. I really think he miscalculated. I think he thought he would be in Kyiv in 3 weeks and able to topple and exchange the government, and then that the West would not really be able to gear up for a response, and the facts on the ground would essentially change, and that would be it. And he didn't anticipate the fact, that is very, I think is just an old Soviet miscalculation, right? It's the idea that the Ukrainian identity is fictional, and that Russians would be welcome there because Russians and Ukrainians are brothers, and they do have many blood ties in both directions, and there are families on both sides of this war that literally, they have the same family fighting on two sides of the war. It's that kind of ties do exist, but yeah, I just think he thought. He believed in the Soviet propaganda, which is that Ukrainians don't exist, and they clearly do, and they were willing to fight and die for it. So that part I thought was quite unfair on Donald Trump's part. That being said, you make peace with your enemies and not with your friends. And by U.S. intelligence estimates, more than 1 million people on both sides have died in this war, and it's in a stalemate. It's a stalemate that favors Russia right now, and those are the facts on the ground.
And I know you don't have depth experience in the diplomatic corps, Inez, but where do you think, if there is going to be common ground to bring this war to a halt, where is it going to be found? Trump telegraphed a little bit, and actually Pete Hegseth probably did it more than Trump did a few days ago, that not extending NATO membership to Ukraine, or Russia perhaps keeping the territory it had prior to the outbreak of the hostilities about 3 years ago now, February 2022. So very eastern Ukraine, Crimea, they would probably get to keep that. But I haven't heard much about what the stick is for Russia to deter them from doing this again. So I don't know if that's something you've thought about, but where do you think, if there is going to be resolution here, where do you think it's found?
Yeah, I think that's obviously going to be the big problem, right? I don't think that Ukraine and Zelensky's insistence that they're going to be able to return to 2014 borders, I just don't see how they're going to effectuate that. Russia controls the territory they already control. I doubt that any of that is going to be rolled back. They don't seem to be able to militarily roll it back. I just don't see a future, and I don't take any pleasure in saying that. But it's not just that they haven't done it, it's that they're making no progress towards doing it, and haven't already for, I think, more than a year. That summer offensive, was that a year ago, 2 years ago, that basically failed to effectuate rolling back the Russian lines. Foreign policy is an art of the possible. So the big problem is how to deter Vladimir Putin from taking the rest of Ukraine after the war is, quote unquote, ended, or there's a ceasefire, right? His MO in the past has just been to seize pieces here and there, right? So, I don't know what the stick will be. Now, I think this is something Donald Trump individually might be very good at, because he has had success with that kind of personal negotiation in the past, right? Just essentially on the strength of his own scariness and word, right? That, yeah, Donald Trump might actually send a nuke to Moscow. Who knows? Right? Don't cross me. I'm going to offer you a deal, but don't cross me. The question is, how is that going to be able to be sustained after Donald Trump leaves the presidency? If you're Vladimir Putin, why don't you just wait for Donald Trump to leave office, and then wait for another weak American president, who knows when that'll be, and take the other part of Ukraine? So guaranteeing that against that is very, very difficult, and that's probably the difficult deal that Ukraine is looking at right now. And that if I were them, I wouldn't want to take it without some kind of very ironclad security guarantee for Western Ukraine.
Yeah, there's got to be an incentive for Ukraine to agree to this. But we'll see what happens in Riyadh, and then how long it takes, and what ultimately gets done, if anything, can get done on that front. A lot of sticky issues, to be sure. If you haven't read The Morning Jolt from Jim Garrity, please do. If you haven't figured it out by now, he's actually over there right now and has plenty of very strong thoughts about a lot of what's been said and done here in the past few days. All right, Inez, time for the Crazy Martini, a double-barreled Crazy Martini, and a little bit on the lighter side, and they both deal with New York City, where you currently live. And let's start with the congestion tolls. The government of New York initially wanted $15 tolls to get into the city. Kathy Hochul then went on camera and said, "I saved you money. They're only going to be $9." Her math is not the strongest. But then there was the fight over the $9 tolls. And yesterday, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy announced those congestion tolls are done.
The New York taxpayer funded those streets. And the way the governor set this up is, she said, even though you already paid for these streets, you can't use those streets unless you pay an additional toll. Well, if I'm the taxpayer, I'm I already paid for the street. Why am I paying an additional toll to the taxes I already paid? There's no free pathway into that cordoned area, right? So if you're a middle income or a lower income shopper or worker, you can't access public roads by any means into this area. That's flat out wrong. And we've never had a program like that where there's not a free public road to get in to a certain area.
And so then after that announcement came down, and Kathy Hochul's going to mention this in a second with the clip we play, the White House sends out a tweet saying, in all caps, "Congestion pricing is dead." And then Manhattan and all of New York is saved. Long live the king. It's kind of like a mock Time magazine cover, except it says Trump at the top and Trump with a crown. That clearly did not sit well with Kathy Hochul, who is now holding a press conference right after that, explaining how she's going to fight for the people of New York to pay more tolls.
At 1:01 p.m. today, the U.S. Department of Transportation emailed us a letter from Secretary Duffy announcing their attempt to end the congestion pricing program in the state of New York. At 1:58 p.m., President Donald Trump tweeted, "Long live the king." I'm here to say New York hasn't labored under a king in over 250 years. You sure as hell are not going to start now. I don't care if you love congestion pricing or hate it. This is an attack on our sovereign identity, our independence from Washington. We are not subservient to a king or anyone else out of Washington.
And as I'm sorry you have to deal with Kathy Hochul as your governor on a regular basis. Not only is she wrong on just about everything, she's just a horrible, horrible politician, not compelling in any way. So what do you make of this particular dust-up? And I guess her argument that the feds shouldn't be interfering here.
Well, it's painful to listen to her try to give like a, rousing speech because she keeps like tripping over herself and this just doesn't go with the words that she's saying. But look, I mean, this is not a popular program. I have some sympathy to the argument that like on its face, it seems very strange. Like obviously this does seem like a local and a state issue. But first of all, we're talking about commuting between New Jersey and New York. So you are talking about crossing state lines in many of these cases. And then, on top of that, apparently there's, I had to look this up, but there's a law written in 1916 allowing the federal government to veto tolls on any roads that are paid for with federal funds, which is virtually like the entire highway system, right? So there is a congressionally authorized power to do this. I don't know if that is even like in this context, even constitutional, the way that power is authorized. I mean, here, I guess it depends what you think of the current precedent of South Dakota against the United States, where that's where we ended up with the drinking age at 21, right? Because South Dakota said, no, we want everybody to be able to drink beer at 18. And the federal government used the funds going to the highway system to basically say, well, every state has to raise the drinking age to 21 because it's a danger on the roads and we pay for the roads. And that was sort of the most tenuous argument that had been used to override a state priority. I tend to think that case was wrongly decided. So like this seems a little closer in nexus than that, right? Because it's not just that was really a stretch. Right, we have to change the drinking age in every state because the federal government paid for the roads. Here, it's directly about the tolls on the federal paid for roads. So we'll see. I guess that's the lawsuit she's trying to tee up. She's going to sue just on the politics side of this. Like, yeah, I'm going to sue Donald Trump to make you pay a toll. Like, it doesn't seem like the greatest hill to die on if I were her. But
yeah, she is politically tone deaf in a lot of different ways. But of course, the reason we have Governor Hochul is because she had been lieutenant governor when Governor Andrew Cuomo was forced to resign for officially the groping scandal, but there was also the nursing home COVID scandal and the book scandal and a lot of other things. But like so many politicians in New York and elsewhere, Andrew Cuomo apparently just can't stay away. So we don't have anything official yet, but we might have it as soon as next week. Here is News 12 giving us the preview that Cuomo's going to be back on your ballot soon, Inez.
Big political news is brewing in the Big Apple. Andrew Cuomo may be back. Sources confirm the former governor is set to announce his campaign by month's end. Cuomo, who resigned in 2021 amid sexual harassment allegations, has been privately telling allies his run is a near certainty. He's securing endorsement and campaign staff, seeing an opportunity as Mayor Eric Adams battles low approval ratings and the federal indictment.
Well, the federal indictment's kind of gone away, but when you compare him, I guess, to maybe Bill de Blasio, it's not the worst comparison if you're Andrew Cuomo, but it seems also to be the New York City mayor's race a rehabilitation program for scandalized Democrats. Anthony Weiner tried to come back and do that until he ran into another scandal and had to drop out again. So, Inez, I'm sure that you have been missing Andrew Cuomo's condescending press conferences where he will talk down to you as if you are a child. And I'm sure you just can't wait for 4 years of this if he ends up getting in and winning.
Well, as you say, we're rich in corrupt potential mayors. That being said, I like my current corrupt potential mayor, and I'm not interested in trading him out for another one. But like I'm sorry, the options are so bad. Andrew Cuomo might even be one of the better options. I mean, if you compare him to Bill de Blasio, I'd much rather have Andrew Cuomo. I like to say that I like principled Republicans and corrupt Democrats because, sometimes a little graft is just the price of like paving the roads and keeping the streets safe. If my mayor is going to do that, I'll permit him in proportion for every illegal migrant that's deported from New York City. Eric Adams may have 1 unit of corruption. He may put his hand in the cookie jar and take 1 cookie out, as far as I'm concerned.
How many
not the
deportations
ideal of
do you
American
need?
governance, I'll admit, but
How many deportations per corrupt act? What's your ratio here?
Yeah, exactly. I want to plot it on a graph. If the migrants are deported and crime goes down in New York City, I will allow Eric Adams X number of first-class flights to Dubai or whatever it is
Turkey,
he's
wherever
doing.
it was.
Turkey.
Amazing. Well, it's already quite a year in New York City. So, Inez, thank you for your time today. We'll do it again tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it.
Looking forward to it as well. Thank you.
Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum, in for Jim Garrity today. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Make sure you subscribe to the 3 Martini Lunch podcast on your favorite podcast platform, as well as on YouTube. Also, get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us all on X. Inez is at Inez Felcher. Jim is at Jim Garrity. I'm at Greg Corombos. Have a great Thursday. Join us again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.